Well, folks, welcome to the Noble Man Podcast. I am thrilled to have as our guest today Pastor Tim Wright. Pastor Wright is in Phoenix, Arizona, I think. That's correct. Yep. Tim? Yeah, and so we're glad that he's here. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I met him a number of years ago in Pennsylvania at a conference training event with the Iron Sharpens Iron Conference Network. Learned about his ministry, and I have been a fan ever since. I want to specifically talk about his book, Searching for Tom Sawyer. So I'm going to come right out of the gate with a question. Tim, you are a pastor, but God has given you a specific passion for something that the local church should do. So tell us what that passion is and how the Lord came to give that to you.
Sure. So to go back about 19 and a half years, I was planting a new church. So I was at a large Lutheran mega church for 20 years, and then 20 years in, they planted the church I'm at now, which I've been at for 20 years. And as I was getting ready to start that church, I came across a book called Why Men Hate Going to Church by David Murrow, a mutual friend. The book had just come out, and he tells me that I was one of the first to actually book him to come and speak. And he came and he did a conference for us on the weekend with some other leaders, and then spoke at our church, and he preached 8 minutes. And as he preached, he had eggs in his hand, and as he was talking, he dropped eggs. And his whole sermon in 8 minutes was about boys and boys leaving the church. And he said, these eggs represent the numbers of boys who have left the Christian church in the time that I've preached. And it turned out the stats were 70 to 90% of boys were leaving the Christian church in their teens and 20s. And I was really, really moved by that. So the first thing I did was I had remembered reading an article by a guy named Michael Gurian, who is a Jewish man by faith and uses brain science research to help teachers and parents better understand how boys learn and how girls learn and how they relate to the world. So it's a nature-based, biology-based, and then nurture-based process. So I wrote him an email and said, hey, look, we're in a church setting. We're somewhat like educators, and I don't know if you'd be interested in helping me. Now, he's a New York Times bestselling author. I'm not expecting any response. He writes me back the next day. Long and the short of it is we've been good friends for 19 years. We've written some stuff together. We do a weekly podcast, have been for 6 years. And he has really, really helped me put into place the pieces of why it is that we're experiencing challenges with our boys, both in the church, in society, in our schools. And that's not in any way, shape, or form to diminish the challenges our girls face. We just don't talk about the boy challenges like we do with girl challenges.
100%. Yeah. I'm familiar with Michael Gurian, have read some of his work, have heard him speak, and David Murrow, as you mentioned, is a mutual friend. So God is just merging these ideas of we're losing boys in the church, and there is some research and some science that can help us. And turns out, like so many other things, well, quite honestly, like everything, God has a design in all of this, doesn't he? And so underlying this is a design. If I could, let me read a quote from page 5 of your book. If we want to raise heroic boys, if we want to call them to follow Jesus into compelling manhood, it's imperative that we understand how their Creator created them, how their brains work, how their brains process information, how boys are wired to follow Jesus differently than girls. If we want to stop the hemorrhaging of boys leaving the church in droves, it's vital that we disciple them as boys, created as boys in the image of God. Man, holy cow, that's a lot in a paragraph there, but that's a load of information. Unpack that for us.
So when you look just at brain scans, you immediately see that there are differences between the way a boy's brain is wired and a girl's brain is wired. And without going into all the details, essentially a boy's brain is wired for action. He learns more visually. He learns through hands-on experience. That doesn't mean that he can't learn through reading, which he can and should. But to sit in a class all day and not move and focus purely on verbal emotive skills versus having the boys get up and move, create something, with their hands, do a project as they're working. Those kinds of things are detrimental to our boys. And just as an example, a boy is going to learn better if you give him a task to do while you are teaching him. And that task can be as simple as draw a cartoon of what I'm talking about. And it stimulates both sides of his brain. A boy only works off one side of the brain. Girls work off of both sides of the brain. So a girl is constantly going back and forth in her brain, taking in facts, putting emotions to them, which helps embed them better. You ask a girl how you're feeling, instantly she can tell you. Ask a boy how you're feeling. Could take him anywhere from 15 minutes to 2 days to access the emotive parts of his brain. Ask him, what are you thinking? Well, you may get a couple monosyllabic answers, but at least you get something out of him. So a lot of our church programming, which is true of schools, has been sit and listen, be quiet, be still. And same is true with worship services, by the way. And so that's really detrimental to the way that boys learn. The other thing I would say, Mike, is that all the research tells us that when you focus your teaching skills onto a boy's brain, girls end up doing better as well, because they can inhabit that world better than a boy's brain can inhabit a girl brain in her world. So it's a lot of it's action, it's a lot of brain breaks, visual, project, hand-oriented. These are generalizations. There's some guys, I'm one of them, I'm very verbal. And so right. You ask me what's the difference between a screwdriver and a hammer, I have to ask my wife that question. But you ask me certain grammar and words and vocabulary, well, I'm your guy. But I'm not typical for most men, and we're all on a spectrum. So there are some guys who, if they can get a sentence out in a day, God bless them. And then there are guys like me, if you can get me to shut up in the day, you're pretty lucky.
Well, and so we're talking specifically about boys in the church, young future men, but so much of what you just said, man, if a wife were to read this book, it would give her insights on her husband as well as her sons, I would think. And you probably hear a lot of feedback on that, because this is much of this is just how God has wired men from the beginning, from boyhood into manhood, correct?
Yes, and I think one of the really interesting things is that moms of boys intuit that their boys are different. Educators, which are mainly female, 90% female in elementary school, they intuit that boys are different. But there hasn't been a lot of science and education around why they're different. And just to give a little history, back in the 1970s, our girls were way behind boys. And so the country said, we need to fix this, and they did. In 1982, which is a long time ago now, girls caught up and surpassed boys. And now we have what Good Morning America this week has been calling a new gender gap. The boys have fallen way behind. So the question is, how do we fix that without hurting all the good work we've done for our daughters? And a lot of that is to recognize that boys learn differently, we relate differently, and to start to take some of that very, very seriously, which we haven't been doing.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be that hard, does it? I mean,
no. So let's. There are. You sort of hate to get into this area, but there are pressures against helping boys. Just a couple examples. For years, Michael Gurian has been working with other male and female advocates to get a White House Commission on boys and men. We have a White House Commission on girls and women, but there is no political energy to put one together about boys and men because of the pushback from certain segments of society who, to give them the benefit of the doubt, don't really understand what we're saying here. They're afraid we're going to go back to some sort of 1950s hierarchy of male-female. That's not it at all. It's the fact that boys aren't competing. Boys are dropping out of school at record rates. Girls are 15% more likely to go to college than boys. Well, and if guys aren't getting proper education, what are they going to do? They're going to end up sitting in their basement playing video games. And
right, and that's what
they're doing. And this past week, Good Morning America, to their credit, has been doing like a 5-10 minute segment every week or every day this week on this new gender gap. And the one that I watched, they quoted Richard Reeves, who's really a great boys advocate. And he said, part of what we need to look at right now is we have really redefined for girls what it means to be a woman in society. We've got all kinds of slogan, girls rule, girls are the future, you go girl. He says we have not done the same thing for boys. And so our boys and our men are lost. All they're hearing from culture is that we're toxic. That's it. Rather than hearing, you're good, you've got potential, you go guy. And so there's just, sometimes there are these political, sociological forces that out of fear for going backwards, right, don't allow the conversation. And yet, moms, educators all realize we got to do something because boys have been behind for so long.
Well, I tell you who else realizes this. It's the police realize this. I mean, maybe we shouldn't get into police stuff, but I kept an article from years ago about some chaos that erupted in downtown Richmond. And the Richmond police chief said the issue is we have all these young men with nothing productive to do, and that it's creating trouble. And so, I go back to there's a book that I read years ago, and it said that soldiers in garrison without a battle to fight, without something to do, become a danger to themselves and the people around them. And this is what happens with boys. They're either going to lean into a passivity that is sitting on the sofa watching video games, or into an aggressive, just uber violence. Well, maybe that's too harsh, but they're going to lean into some other negative behaviors. And really, it doesn't make any difference which of those ditches a boy falls into. They're both dangerous.
That's right. So that's exactly well said. That boys are tending right now to fall either passive, and so they become a burden on their families, and then eventually a burden on society, or they become overly angry. I'll use that word, overly angry in the negative sense of the word, and then therefore they become destructive. And another part of what's happening is there is some science, now not everybody necessarily agrees with this, but I'm seeing more and more studies to suggest that this may be true, that testosterone levels in boys have dropped by 30% over the last 30 years or so, and from toxins, all this stuff in the environment. And you would think that if we have less testosterone, we'd be less aggressive. But less testosterone makes us more depressed and therefore more aggressive. And so we've got all kinds of stuff happening. And then very, very few centers anywhere in the country that treat male issues, male health issues, depression. We know that men die by suicide at a much, much higher rate than women do. Obviously commit far more violent crime than women do. The 98% of the prison population, male. So it would be easy to look at those statistics and say there's something wrong with men. I look at those statistics and say there's something wrong with the system. Because these are human beings created in the image of God who have so much potential to bring to society and the world. And we are not set up in our systems right now to help these boys discover their true potential.
Right. Well, so our kids, we sent them to public school, and so we went through that whole process. And I there's a whole long story behind that, but I believe parents have to be involved regardless of where the education takes place. And but there are now homeschool opportunities. There's private school. There's private Christian school. There's all this stuff. we may not be able to fix all of that, but you and I are churchmen. Yeah. And the place where we can have some impact, and for goodness sake, the place where we should be raising up godly men and having an impact on culture by raising men who see a vision for what God could do, for creating and cultivate it, for taking dominion over the earth and building and developing. God planted that in us, and we need to be teaching that in the local church. We need to be investing in these young boys. So what does that look like when we say, yes, we're living in this culture that is pushing against these boys, but in the church, what can we do? Let's kind of hang there for a few minutes.
I would recommend a few things, and these are things churches would need to try. Some may work, and that's it or not. Yeah. But number one, I would recommend that in discipleship programming, whether you call it Sunday school, which is a bad name for boys' school, why would I want to go another day of school?
Yeah.
But whatever it is, I would recommend starting probably at least by third grade through whatever becomes the end of elementary school, separate them out from the girls so that you have quality time with those boys to talk about issues that boys care about from the perspective of boys. The one challenge that boys have a lot right now is that they know they're falling behind girls. They're embarrassed that they fall behind girls. And when you, for example, have a girl read a Bible passage who reads it fluently, and then a boy who reads it and stumbles over every word and then is laughed at and feels just horrible about himself, we need to separate them out, so that girls can talk about the gospel from a girl perspective, boys can talk about it from a boy perspective. And then we can have men lead them. And so when you got these boys in their groups, whatever you're doing, make sure that it's highly interactive, it's game-based, it's competition-based. Don't go more than, say, 4 or 5 minutes with a lecture before you break and do something else. And if it's possible, let's say, for example, you're talking about what it means to be a man of honor. Well, have somebody, start some kits for boys, swords. And so the boys are painting swords, maybe putting a name on the sword. And as they're doing that, the teacher is talking a bit about honor and what the sword represents. That the sword represents your power. How are you going to use your power? So that they are doing something as they listen to a lesson. They've got an object in their hand. They go home with mom and dad. Okay, what's the sword about? Well, the sword is my power, and how am I going to use that? So that would be one thing, to do that with boys. It's really important that boys and girls go through a rite of passage program about the time they turn 13. Dr. Green and I have created several of those. We've created church-based programs. We've created programs for dads and their sons, moms and their daughters. TimWrightMinistries.org for that, TimWrightMinistries.org. And that's just a rite of passage is a set-aside period of time to pour into boys masculine energy and to say, this is what it looks like to follow Jesus into manhood. And these are the character qualities, however you want to talk about that. That applies then into youth group. If you've got a youth group, you don't need to separate boys from girls all the time, but you do need to make sure that you're thinking about how a boy brain works and focus on creating your programming around that. The girls will follow. The girls will get it because their brains are wired to do so. So not a lot of sitting, and they can sit in groups and talk about things. Boys aren't against that. But if you're sitting with long lectures, you can forget it. It's not going to happen. And then I also just encourage, one of my passions is to get kids worshiping with their parents. And all the research tells us now that if kids go to Sunday school and youth group and never go to worship, they're highly unlikely to ever go to worship because they've never been taught to. If they go to worship and Sunday school, or if they go to a part of a worship service and then part of the service is Sunday school, more likely to go to worship. We don't have Sunday school. We just have the kids in worship with us. And so when we're designing our worship services, one of the things I keep in mind all the time is a male brain. And so we mix things up. Every 4 or 5 minutes, something changes. The longest we go is a sermon, which is 12 to 15 minutes. And then, per our friend David Murrow, we're trying to add an object lessons, make it visual, so that it will engage a male brain. It will engage a female brain. And we're not having any problem getting women to church. Well, let me just say, we didn't have any problem getting women to come to church. Since COVID, we're having a problem getting anyone to come to church. We've sort of lost, it seems like we're losing a whole generation of people. But the church doesn't have an issue trying to reach women. Church has an issue trying to reach men, which is really ironic, isn't it? When it was built on these 12 men and the women who followed Jesus as well, that we're having a hard time getting traction. But again, I think it's because we live in a system today that better understands how a girl brain works. And most of what we do is sit, listen, be quiet. What are you feeling? Versus action. Last thing I would say is boys need a compelling vision for their lives. And every boy is different. You're going to have some boys, they're all sports, they're alpha males. You're going to have other boys who are sensitive, they're sensitive souls, poets, musicians, and everything in between. So just to say that men are tough and men are rough, that's not true. A compelling vision is driven by who Jesus is and following him and caring about what Jesus cared about. And what did Jesus care about? Putting broken things back together. And that's what guys do. That's language guys understand. Putting broken things together. As our friend David Murrow reminds us, Jesus never said, I want you to have a personal relationship with me. Jesus said, follow me. And those are action words. Guys get that. We understand following somebody. And that's the language we should be using more and more in our congregations.
I love what you're saying about how if you teach with the men in mind, then the women will come along. And again, David Murrow, I've heard him say that women can do masculine, but men can't do feminine.
That's right.
It's
that's
just not going to happen.
Obviously, that's
way.
A generalization, but that's true probably 80% of the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we have to keep those things in mind. I just want to throw out a couple of ideas that I've encountered over the years. There is a school in Raleigh, North Carolina called Iron Academy. It's a Christian school for boys to raise them into godly men, Iron Academy. And one of the things that happens there is they keep a medicine ball in the classroom for the older kids. And so they'll teach for 8 or 10 minutes or whatever. They've got some rhythm, and then they'll get up and they'll pass toss the medicine ball around as they're reviewing that day. And so something like that. I just say, folks, if you are teaching boys, find a way. One year, I was working with 4th and 5th grade boys at our church, and we decided to do bucket drums. And so we would just beat on drums with buckets with dowel rods every Wednesday night. And it was chaotic. It had no musical value whatsoever, but it was awesome. And the boys loved it, and they couldn't wait to get there. So this can be cheap. It can be inexpensive, but it's fun, and it attracts the guys because you get their attention. And listen, there's some people who are listening to this who probably say, well, it sounds like you're just goofing off and you're having all this stuff. But no, you're setting up the place where their hearts and their minds are ready to receive a message. And you have to make sure that what you share with them in those moments is pithy and valuable and has a handle on it so they can take it with them. Is that
absolutely
consistent with
absolutely.
where you would go?
And again, to add in movement, your idea with the medicine ball or something just as simple as having a Nerf ball, and you just toss it back and forth with the guys, and you just say, here's a question for you, and you throw it at one of the boys, and he catches it or drops it, whatever, and or to do little competitions. You have two boys, they're facing off each other, sort of like a family feud, and you build some competition in. You do want to be sensitive to the various kinds of boys that you have in your classroom, right? Some are going to really excel with movement and catching and sports. Some will be a little bit better with writing things down. And that's why a holistic perspective is good. But what's always important for guys, no matter what, short teaching, pithy teaching, standing up, taking a 5-minute brain break, doing a little competition, getting back at it again. It just resets the brain every single time. And that applies in the classroom. That applies when you're having a sex talk with your son, and go for a walk, And, Michael Gurian says, if you want to talk to your son, go out for a walk or go shoot baskets, because the action will stimulate the brain to communicate. If you just want him to stare at you, just sit at the table and ask him questions, and he's not going to answer. But get him moving. Any boy, get him moving. Same true with our daughters.
Well, and I would... true, and it goes for older guys, too. I just had Nate Larkin on as a podcast guest a short while ago. He wrote a book called Samson and the Pirate Monks, founded the Samson Society, deal with sexual purity. And when he begins to have a conversation with a guy where a guy is ready to begin to do some work and is getting serious about trying to move to a place of victory, he calls it the first walk, and they just go for a walk and they have a conversation. So that works even with older guys. I mean, this is valuable stuff. And then I think about Jesus walking with the disciples. How much must they have learned walking from village to village, the conversations that they had, and then around a fire and so forth. So, I mean, this is Jesus' teaching method. Would you affirm that?
And of course, what else? What did he do when he was teaching? He always used pictures. Look at the birds. Let's just stop. Look at the birds. Look what they're doing. Now, let me tell you about God. And at least as we have it recorded in Scripture, we don't have any really long sermons from Jesus except the Sermon on the Mount, which is probably a number of his sermons put together in one place. But even that you could probably read through in 20 minutes max. My joke is you can preach like Jesus and keep their attention, or you can preach like Paul, who preached so long the guy fell asleep and died falling out the window, right?
That's right.
And there's a little miracle at the end for Paul, so that added some excitement. But I'd rather be Jesus keeping it short than putting people to sleep.
Yeah. All right. So one of the questions that I had for you was, you wrote this book in 2013. You're doing a podcast actively now. And so you're still current with this. Man, for goodness sakes, things are very different now than they were in 2013. And I folks, I would just tell you, we'll put a link to this book in the show notes. It is absolutely worth reading. I've got it marked up, highlighted, and everything. But man, you throw social media into the mix and the pressures that come with that, and then you throw COVID in and trying to do COVID education. Talk to us about some of the unique scenarios that we're facing with young men right now because of these changes in the culture.
Well, I'll mention just a couple. A lot of things we've talked about are still true. On the negative side, boys probably experienced more fallout from COVID than girls, just because of the way the brains respond. And I heard somewhere recently that boys are about a year behind girls right now. And boys are always behind girls early on. Their brain is about a year and a half to 2 years behind girls in preschool when it comes to reading and so on. And they do get caught up if you get boys reading. So our boys have fallen more behind. We have had more pushback on boys in some ways. And there's some good reason not to push it all on boys and men, but there have been some men behaving badly in our culture. And part of that is because we don't hold up this really positive view of men. What we do understand, which is interesting, is that when men behave badly, we get that, but nobody's really willing to step up and say, but this is what a good man should look like. That's where we're having a problem getting traction. I would say another thing that's very concerning, and so I'm going to put in a little plug for myself here. Boys are falling dramatically behind in reading. And this has been the case, but overall, from preschool all the way through college, they are way behind in reading. And we live in a culture where reading is absolutely essential. And one of the things that I've been moved by over the last few years is that issue. So I started writing a couple of years ago a new middle school fantasy adventure called The Adventures of Toby Baxter. The Adventures of Toby Baxter, just go to Amazon. Third book just came out. The books are about 200 pages long. They're quick moving, lots of humor. And in each one of them, I embed, when they don't know it, a rite of passage. And so each time it's built around a character qualities. So the first book is around hero, and what are the 4 words for hero? Then it's wise. This one that just came out is good. And each one of them is this adventure of a guy who's nothing like a hero, sort of stumbles his way into various things, surrounded by these friends in this magical world. To get boys reading, girls will love the book, but I really wrote it with boys. Short, to the point, funny, little teaching embedded. The Adventures of Toby Baxter, because the reading for boys is really dramatically hurting our boys right now, and then therefore it will hurt society. If I could say a positive, I would go back to what's happening with Good Morning America this week for depending on who your audience is, to look at a liberal or a left-leaning or mainstream news media company, or just news media, whatever you want to call them, to say that there is a new gender gap, and that the gap is between women who are succeeding and men who are failing. That's a remarkable move forward in our culture. And there have been, over the last couple of years, increasingly news outlets running stories on this. Hasn't gained energy yet, but there are new voices. Richard Reeves, I mentioned earlier, is one of them, who's doing some really, really good work around boys. Started a new a center for boys. Of course, Michael Goering continues to do good work, and some of the other guys who've been doing it for a long time. So I would say that even though there are challenges ahead, and we need to take them very seriously, there do seem to be more and more advocates arising who are saying, we've got, if we want our girls to succeed, if we want our culture to grow up, we need to invest in our boys and turn their storyline around for the sake of our culture, for the sake of family building, and we can do that in a way that doesn't, in any way, shape, or form, devalue the important work that we've done with our daughters.
Absolutely. I've got 3 sons and a daughter.
Yep.
The daughter is the youngest, and so I've invested intentionally, strategically in my sons, and enjoy that. But man, there's something precious about my daughter, and so I want her to have all the opportunities and experiences. But I also know that inside of her is a desire to be a wife and a mother, and to find a good and godly man to do family with. And so we've got to build those guys out there. It's a big piece of what we have to do.
That's such a good point, Mike, because what we're hearing from a lot of young women today is, where are the good men? Where are the good men?
That's right. That's right. Listen, let me ask you this about I know the reading part. How do we get guys to read the Bible? Are you okay with graphic
absolutely.
Bibles and some of these adventure Bibles? Talk about the value of some of those things that specifically target boys, because there may be some parents who say, well, I'm not going to do that because that's not a real Bible. But what are your thoughts about that?
So you have a choice. They either don't read the Bible at all, or they might read this graphic Bible.
Yeah.
And how is a graphic Bible? I understand that a graphic Bible, most of them are sort of paraphrases, right? Some are word for word, but it's no different than reading a Bible in Spanish or German or English or French. It's just another way of experiencing God's word to us. We do know that boys, far more than girls, are consumers of graphic novels. And there are some educators who don't count that as reading, but it's reading. And if that gets them to read, if it gets them to read Scripture, man, I'm all for it. Anything to get boys to read Scripture, even if it's just, according to new studies, 5 minutes a day. 5 minutes a day can make all the difference.
Yeah. Now, it occurs to me that when we're saying graphic novels, graphic Bibles, we may need to define what we mean by graphic there. Not graphic in terms of, it just occurs that not graphic in terms of violence or any of the darkness, but explain what a graphic Bible
basically,
is.
Graphic means it's comic book form, right? So they refer to them sort of in the business as graphic novels, graphic books. graphic as in drawing, not graphic as in
high graphic design content with the whole thing. So
it's a good point.
You can get a reaction to that sometimes. Yeah. Listen, let me ask another question. I think about this. There's so many guys who want their sons to do stuff that they won't do themselves. And so, I wish Johnny were more involved in the church. I wish Johnny would read his Bible and be engaged in what's going on with the youth group. And so, guys, I do not pull any punches with you. Man, if they don't see you reading your Bible, if they don't see you engaging the Word, if they don't see you valuing the church, valuing your own personal spiritual growth, then it's going to be hard for them to ever say, this is what men do. And so we have to set those examples for our sons and for the boys around us who aren't our sons but are still watching us. So speak to that, Tim.
Absolutely. Boys are going to emulate their dads. If it's not important to dad, it's not important to me. So, one great gift a dad can give to his son, his children, is to sit down at night, again, 5 minutes, take out the Gospel of Mark in a version that reads easy for everybody, read a Jesus story, just one story. Take a few minutes, talk about it. What's Jesus up to here? Why did Jesus do that? Why were people angry at Jesus? That's it. Or you might say, what is this teaching you about Jesus today? And you may or may not get an answer, but you're inculcating Scripture into your children by reading it along with them. And I would say, same with any kind of book. If you can't get your boy to read, then sit down and say, you know what, we're going to read this book together. And we're just going to go a chapter at a time. We don't have to talk about it. We're just going to read it together and create in your son, your daughter, but your son, a love for words and for reading. It will serve him well. He's not going to be served well if he can't read.
Yes. Amen. I'm all for that. Now, I'm gonna give you one more opportunity. I'll toss you another softball here, and that is, I am not a fan of dads saying that they're doing their devotion on their phone in front of their families, because you could be doing anything when you're looking at a screen. And so, dads, I want to see you with a paper Bible. And back to this idea of being tactile and experiencing stuff. Man, put real books and real things in the hands of your kids, and as often as you can, move away from a digital world where all they're doing is looking at screens. Let them hold real things, especially real books.
Boy, that's a really good point. And I would say two things. First of all, absolutely affirm that. We need to get them off of screens, period. And I just have been doing some research on the difference, and there's some actual brain scans now to show a brain on books and a brain on screens. And you can see the difference between those two. So we need to get kids reading books. Now, a Kindle version is different than reading off of your phone. The light is different. The feel is different. It's more tactile. I would give this little caveat, though. Our kids are going to have phones, so let's teach them how to use them appropriately. And so, if there are times where, okay, I can't get my son to pick up a book, but if he reads it off of his phone, at least he's reading, well, I'm going to concede that. But I will continue to push to get the tactile experience, that there's something about a book, putting a bookmark in, flipping a page over, all those things, the smell, that adds to the book itself that you cannot get through a phone or a Kindle for that matter. But Kindles, people often ask us on our podcast, what about Kindles? Well, Kindles are a different animal than even an iPad or a phone because of the screen and the lights on, the kind of light that they emit. So, but you're right, absolutely. Get them into books, get them into newspaper, comic books. They want to read comic books. God bless them. Comic books, I've got a grandson into anime right now. That's all he reads, but he's reading. So I have no problem with it.
Yeah, so it just occurs to me to say, guys, pay attention to where your kids are, meet them there, and then pray that God's going to give you wisdom, discernment, conversational opportunities, even tone of voice that will help bring them from where they are to, I mean, we want them to love Jesus and love his word and meet Jesus in the word. I mean, these are the things that we want, but they're not going to go from 0 to 100 miles an hour. And so we have to go there, meet them, and entice them. I don't think you're going to get as much positive result out of pushing them as you will inviting them.
That's right.
That's why Jesus, the whole follow me is compelling. It's not go do this. It's follow me and do what you see me doing is the way Christ led his disciples. And we need to emulate that even in our own homes as we disciple our kids.
Right. In our homes. And I do think if there are a group of men who've got sons, get together in your church and create some father-son experiences or father or men-boy experiences for those boys whose dads aren't around, that are competition-based, the boys versus the man, or you break them in some of the men and the boys. Just do some competition stuff. Do a couple quick teaching sessions in between all that. Do a barbecue. Always have food. Just do some fun stuff. Let those boys see Christian men and what it's like just to hang out with them. And we've even done it at our church where we've invited the boys and the girls so that our girls can see Christian men who are modeling faith and who are just real guys, but they love Jesus and are following Jesus. Our daughters don't often get to see that either. So those kinds of things they're simple to do. And they're fairly inexpensive. It just takes one or two guys in a church to say, we're going to put together some really goofball competitions. We're going to spend an hour and a half together, and we're going to have some fun with our kids.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, listen, we've covered a lot of ground, and I want to be attentive to time here for you and for our listeners. But we've talked a little bit about parents. We've talked a little bit about children's ministry, and even spoken to a little bit of youth stuff. You are a lead pastor at a church in Phoenix, and I know that we have some lead pastors, senior pastors on that listen to this podcast. So, encourage those guys. Just speak to them about what it will mean for the future of their families, their church, and the kingdom of God if we begin to invest in young men and really point them in this direction.
Interestingly, I think even those of us senior pastors who are male don't quite get how males work. Partly because a lot of us pastors are verbal and maybe verbal emotive. We're good with words. We're good with thinking concepts. A lot of guys aren't. And so we need to be spending time with our men, maybe getting a small group of 5 to 10 guys and just discipling them, but listening to them, being discipled by them. To do some reading, read Murrow's book, read my book on boys, to get a sense of how the male brain functions in the world. I do think that there are going to be some pastors who may need to step back and ask the question, do I need to be preaching for 45 minutes on a Sunday if I want to reach men? I'm going to say the answer is going to be no 99% of the time. So how in 10 to 15 minutes can I engage my congregation, particularly men, with one point for the week? One story, one object lesson, whatever it is, that all comes down to this one thing when the sermon is done. Whether the message is Jesus wants you to know today that you're the one that God loves. And the whole sermon has been that for 10 to 15 minutes. Jesus calls you today to follow him in bringing grace to your neighbors. And so here's one way to do that this way, whatever it is. And then allow the rest of the service to also function as the sermon time, to allow the music to speak a message. We do a kids' time, so it gives me a chance to do an extra little 3 to 4 minute thing. And right. Men listen to kids' sermons more than they do to big people sermons. But right. How can you create a service where the central part of the service isn't a 45-minute sermon. The central part of the service is the message that you want to bring through that whole hour of music, sermon. If you do sacraments, communion, if you do kids' time, whatever it is, and how can you every 7 to 8 minutes make sure that service changes a bit so that nobody is sitting listening to one thing except maybe a 12, 13-minute sermon. You're constantly re-engaging their attention. Having them stand up and recite the Apostles' Creed, for example, or having them do whatever it is you're going to have them do. Stand up and sing a song or listen to this song. And I think pastors are going to have to think about different ways to engage attention spans that are radically different than they were back in 1950.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me that Paul told Timothy to preach the word in season and out of season, and a lot of pastors get hung up on the way I preach the word is through that lengthy sermon, but we may need to explore exactly what it means to preach the word sometimes.
There's a reason why TED Talks work.
Yeah,
and their rule is 10 to 12 minutes.
Yeah.
And they're getting millions and millions of views.
Yeah.
Because that's about, now people will listen to podcasts longer.
Yeah.
But there's something.
But it's passive. Most people are going to listen to this while they're doing something else.
That's right. They're driving in a car. They're ironing clothes. They're raking their yard, whatever. That's right. They're doing something else. So how do you engage? And I think, and this is where David Murrow's book would be really helpful for church leaders.
Yeah. All right. I thought of one more thing that I just got to hit you with, and that is we build so much of our ministry for Noble Warriors around 2 Timothy 2:2. The things you've heard me teach in the presence of many witnesses, teach to faithful men who will teach others also. And so this idea of multiplying ministry by investing in faithful men. And, so those faithful men can be our own sons. They can be men in a small group. They can be, it can have many forms and formats. But here's an interesting thing. I'm encountering more and more guys who call me or reach out to us and say, Mike, my son's not engaging, or I've got something going on with one of my kids and he's not responding. Could you meet with him? Would you do something? And I can't meet with everyone. You can't meet with everyone who someone invites you to. And so I've come to this conclusion. I've got sons right now in multiple states, multiple continents. And I have to pray that there will be other godly men that will mentor them and reach out to them and walk with them and invest them. And so one of the things I've started saying to men is, don't just sit there wishing someone would engage your son. Be the answer to another man's prayer for their son by engaging a young man. Get involved in teaching young boys. Get involved in student ministry. Mentor a young dad. So speak to that just as a final touch about how important it is for us as men to go and invest in another guy.
Yeah, I've said for years that the number one purpose for men's ministry is to raise up the next generation of men. And if men's ministries aren't in some way, shape, or form doing that, they need to rethink. And that's a challenge even for my men's group, because it's pretty easy just to enjoy being together as men. But how do we equip each other to pour ourselves in the next generation? The truth is, and Mike, you know this, a lot of guys would love to do it. We just don't know how. And so, something like Noble Warriors is a great resource for men. My book is a resource. I've had some churches where the guys got together and they studied that book and they said, all right, what are 3 or 4 things we can do now to help our boys? So there are tools out there, and I'd say get them and start. And it just takes 1 or 2 guys. 1 or 2 guys. You don't even need the pastor. If the pastor says, God bless you, go ahead and do it, then go for it and see what happens. And God is looking for men to step up and pour masculine energy into our boys.
Amen. And I think that's why Jesus liked Peter, because Peter was going to do something. He had to be course corrected quite a bit. But guys, just get started. God or your pastor will step in and guide you a little bit if you need it. But go get busy with the gospel to advance the kingdom. So, Tim, thank you so much for your time here. This has been a bunch of fun. Folks, check out Searching for Tom Sawyer, How Parents and Congregations Can Stop the Exodus of Boys from Church. Visit timwrightministries.org and check out his books. Give us the titles of the books again, Tim.
So it's The Adventures of Toby Baxter is the middle school series. May not be up on that site, but just go to Amazon, The Adventures of Toby Baxter, or Tim Wright. Just put in Tim Wright. You should find me and the Tom Sawyer book as well. Yep. Love to have people take a read.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Tim, thank you so much for your time. This has been a joy, and I think it will be profitable for the folks who listen to the Noble Warriors podcast. Folks, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Noble Man podcast, and we will look forward to being with you then. God bless you.